A millionaire kicked a beggar out of his luxury restaurant. Days later, he was shocked to find out who the beggar's father was. The sun lazily rose on the horizon, tinting the sky with soft shades of gold and orange. Derek's mansion, an imposing structure with glass windows reflecting the dawn's light, was silent. However, inside, Derek's hurried steps echoed down the marble staircase. He adjusted his impeccable black suit as he descended, already mentally reviewing the points he would discuss at that day's meeting. In the living room, Declan, his 10-year-old son, was sitting on the couch playing with a doll. When he saw his father, he dropped the toy and ran to him. "Daddy, are you leaving again?" he asked, crossing his arms and pouting, his tone accusatory. Derek stopped, looking at his son with a tired but affectionate smile. "Yes, Declan. But I promise I'll be back in time for dinner. Tonight is just for us. We'll talk about the new video game you want, okay?" Declan narrowed his eyes, clearly suspicious. "You always say that and take forever. What if you don't come back?" Those words made Derek pause for a moment. He knelt in front of his son and held his tiny shoulders. "I always come back, son. Even if it takes a while, even if it's hard, I come back to you. Now promise me you'll behave, okay?" Declan nodded reluctantly, but with a small smile emerging on his lips. "Okay, Daddy, but you really promise?" "I promise," Derek replied, kissing the boy's forehead before leaving. As he got into the chauffeured car, he adjusted his tie and began reviewing the documents for the meeting. The construction of the luxury restaurant was an ambitious project, and he needed to be prepared for any objections from the other investors. On the way, the car stopped at a stoplight, and Derek noticed a woman sitting on the sidewalk. She looked exhausted, with dirty clothes and a vacant stare that conveyed despair. Without hesitation, Derek asked the driver to stop. "Wait here," he said, getting out of the car and approaching the woman. He crouched down and took out a large bill from his wallet. "Here, buy something to eat. You shouldn't be going through this." The woman looked at him, her eyes filling with tears. "Thank you, sir. God bless you. I don't know what to say." Derek smiled slightly. "Say you'll take care of yourself." He returned to the car, feeling a little lighter, as if that small gesture could make a difference in such a cold world. A few minutes later, he arrived at the meeting venue, an imposing building in the city center that already housed other luxury ventures of the group. Colton, one of the partners and the one responsible for the project, was waiting for him at the entrance with a broad, confident smile. "Derek, finally! Come on, everyone's eager to start." "We have something grand today," said Colton, greeting him enthusiastically. He led Derek to the conference room where the other 4 investors were already seated around a rectangular polished wood table. The room was luxurious, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. A silver coffee maker gleamed on a cart next to the table, exuding the strong aroma of fresh coffee. The investors chatted animatedly, laughing and exchanging jokes, while Colton organized the detailed plans for the restaurant. "A toast to the future," the investor repeated, raising his cup with a confident smile that reflected everyone's ambition in the room. Derek and the others raised their cups, toasting to the success that seemed inevitable. The strong aroma of coffee filled the luxurious setting, while the expansive windows let in the golden glow of the morning sun. The investors sipped their coffee slowly, each more immersed in their own thoughts and plans than in Colton's words. The meeting seemed to be following its normal course until something strange began to happen. The first sign that something was wrong came from Miguel, one of the group's oldest investors. He grabbed his throat, coughing violently, knocking his cup to the floor. The sound of breaking glass drew everyone's attention. "Miguel, are you okay?" Derek asked, rising from his chair, his eyes wide with concern. Miguel tried to respond but could only emit a muffled sound before falling out of his chair, his hands clutching his chest. The look of panic on his face said more than any words could. "Someone call an ambulance," shouted another investor, Raphael. But before he could reach for the phone, he too began to feel the effects. Violent coughs escaped his throat, and he stumbled backwards, knocking his chair over with a crash. Derek looked around, his heart pounding. "What's happening? What's wrong with them?" He placed his coffee cup on the table, now suspicious. Before any answer could emerge, another of the investors, Enrique, began to suffocate, his eyes red and bloodshot, his trembling hands trying to support himself on the table. The coffee, Something in the coffee, he managed to mutter before collapsing. The bodies of 3 men now lay on the floor of the conference room, while Colton remained motionless, watching it all with a cold stare. Derek, without realizing it, was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles were white. He looked at Colton, who seemed strangely calm. "Colton, do something! They're dying!" Derek shouted, feeling the adrenaline rush as he tried to understand what was happening. But before he could react, he felt a strange pain in his chest. It was as if a fire was rising from within him. The coffee, the only thing they had all consumed. Derek tried to control his breathing, but the air seemed to escape from his lungs as if he was suffocating from within. His heavy, watery eyes met Colton's, who remained impassive, almost like a satisfied spectator of his own macabre play. Derek gasped, his voice barely coming out as he stammered, "No, it can't be. You knew." Colton, seated with the elegance of someone who had rehearsed that moment countless times, slowly rose, the sound of the wooden chair creaking under the weight of the growing tension in the room. He walked to the front of the table, his hands crossed behind his back, as if he were about to deliver a victory speech. His cold eyes scanned the room, passing over the crumpled bodies of his now lifeless colleagues, and finally rested on Derek, who was struggling to remain standing. "Of course I knew," Colton replied, his tone laced with disdain and satisfaction. He crossed his arms, tilting his head slightly as a cruel smile formed on his lips. "You've always been so arrogant, so sure that this restaurant would be the legacy of all of us. But what you never understood is that I never wanted to share that legacy." Derek staggered, grasping the edge of the table to avoid falling. His vision was starting to blur, but his mind was still trying to process Colton's words. "You betrayed us. Why?" he managed to mumble, his voice a thread of disbelief and pain. Colton moved closer, bending down to meet Derek at eye level, his eyes shining with an almost supernatural coldness. "Why should I share it? The success, the profit, the prestige? This restaurant will be mine, Derek, mine alone. I made the plans, I created the vision. You were just obstacles in my way, men who thought themselves irreplaceable, but who were merely dead weights." Derek felt his body weaken even more. He fell to his knees, his hands slipping off the table and hitting the cold marble. His face was pale, his breathing increasingly irregular. He raised his eyes to Colton, his voice barely audible. "You killed all of us?" Colton let out a low, dry laugh that echoed through the now tomb-like silence of the room. He stood up, adjusting his tie as if preparing for a photograph. "Don't worry, Derek. You'll be remembered as visionaries who participated in the beginnings of something grand. But unfortunately, you'll also be remembered as victims of a tragic accident." He took a step back, observing Derek as if he were a work of art he had just completed. Derek tried to speak, but his voice was gone. His strength abandoned him, and he fell to the side, feeling his face press against the icy floor. His half-closed eyes could still see Colton, a dark silhouette against the morning sunlit windows. Colton's words echoed in his mind like a hammer, pounding the betrayal, the greed, the coldness. It was hard to believe that someone he considered an ally could be so cruel. Colton, now the only one standing, walked over to the table. He calmly picked up the restaurant's plans, which had been scattered during the chaos, straightened them with almost surgical precision, and put them back in his folder. "Such a pity, isn't it?" he said almost casually, looking at the bodies around him. So many dreams, so many ambitions, all destroyed by a simple cup of coffee. He took one last look at Derek, now motionless, and left the room with slow steps as if he wanted to savor every second of his victory. When he reached the door, Colton paused for a moment, his firm hand on the handle, as if absorbing the moment. He calmly adjusted the folder in his hand, like a satisfied maestro after the last note of his symphony. The muffled sound of passing cars and the distant murmur of the city contrasted with the deathly silence he left behind. The room, which minutes before had housed voices full of ambition and promises of success, was now a mausoleum of the power he had just conquered. He took a deep breath, and the metallic smell of poison mixed with the aroma of coffee lingered in the air, impregnating his senses like an indelible mark of his action. Colton smiled, a smile not of happiness, but of triumph. He opened the door and crossed the threshold, leaving the room full of bodies behind without looking back. Outside, the day went on, indifferent to the lives that had just ended. The sun shone brightly in the sky, hurried workers walked the sidewalks, and the sound of horns and engines filled the air, as if nothing had happened. Colton walked slowly, each step echoing in his mind like a constant beat of victory. For him, this was not just another day. It was the beginning of a new chapter, the milestone of his definitive ascent to the top. As he descended the building steps, Colton felt the symbolic weight of his folder, which now represented absolute control over the restaurant he had so meticulously planned. This will be more than just a restaurant, he thought to himself, a subtle smile still lingering on his lips. It will be a legacy. My legacy. He could already visualize the grandeur of the opening, the list of exclusive guests, the flashes of cameras and the articles exalting his genius as a visionary entrepreneur. When he arrived at the car, Colton gestured for the driver to open the door. Before getting in, he looked up at the building that housed the meeting room. For an instant, a shadow of what could be regret passed over his expression, but it was quickly replaced by determination. He got into the car and settled the briefcase beside him as the vehicle began to glide smoothly through the busy streets. Inside the room, the bitter smell of the poisoned coffee continued to permeate the environment, a persistent reminder of the betrayal that had taken place there. The lifeless bodies of the investors, once symbols of power and ambition, now lay still, victims of a greed that had exceeded all limits. The light streaming through the windows seemed to highlight the scene in cruel irony, as if even the sun itself was aware of the tragedy. For Colton, the weight of those lives was insignificant. He had calculated every detail with precision, and now his plan was in motion. They were in my way, he muttered to himself as the car moved through the streets. Nothing more than steps to something greater. The surrounding city remained oblivious to what had happened. People rushed by, absorbed in their own concerns, while Colton was already thinking about the next stage. He knew that success required sacrifices, and he had no doubt that those sacrifices were necessary. Still, in the depths of the silent room, an overturned cup continued to drip the remains of the fatal coffee, mingling with the white marble like an invisible signature of Colton's greed. Life had withdrawn from that space, but the story he left behind was a grim reminder that for some, power is worth any price. And so, as the city kept turning in its indifference, Colton pressed on, more determined than ever to turn his restaurant into a monument, not only to luxury, but also to his own ability to dominate and prevail. Yet the shadow of his actions followed him, invisible to the world but ever present, waiting for the right moment to claim the price of his unbridled ambition. Meanwhile, Derek's mansion lay shrouded in an unsettling silence. Declan, sitting on the living room couch, stared fixedly at the entrance, anxiously awaiting his father's return. Dinner had already been served and cleared without him touching the food. The table now sat empty, the only light in the house coming from the dim lamp beside the couch. "He's taking too long," Declan muttered to himself, folding his arms and frowning. He held the video game controller in his hands that Derek had promised to discuss with him that night. Dad never breaks a promise. He always comes back. Outside, the night advanced, and the cold air carried with it a sense of emptiness that Declan couldn't explain. The servants exchanged worried glances, but none of them said a word. They knew something was wrong, but no one wanted to be the bearer of bad news. Suddenly, the silence of the mansion was broken by the sound of distant sirens. Red and blue lights briefly illuminated the entrance, and Declan, intrigued, ran to the window to see what was happening. He saw a police car pull up in front of the house. 2 officers stepped out of the vehicle, their expressions serious and cautious. "Police?" Declan asked, confused. He ran to the door before any of the servants could intercept them and flung it open, the cold night wind sending a chill across his skin. The officers paused for a moment, surprised to see the boy. One of them, older and with a somber expression, stepped forward. "Are you Declan, Mr. Derek's son?" he asked, his voice low but laden with gravity. Declan nodded, gripping the door tightly. "Yes. Where's my dad? Is he coming? Why are you here?" The older officer glanced at his partner, visibly uncomfortable, before crouching down to Declan's level. "Declan, we need to talk to you about your father. He was in an important meeting today, wasn't he?" "Yes," Declan replied, his voice trembling slightly. "He said he'd be back for dinner, he promised." The officer took a deep breath before continuing, carefully choosing his words. Your father suffered a grave incident during that meeting, Declan. There was something with the coffee he and others drank. I'm sorry to say this, but your father didn't make it. The words echoed through Declan's mind like thunder. He froze, his eyes wide as he tried to comprehend what he had just heard. No, that can't be. You're mistaken. My dad promised he'd come back, he cried, his voice rising in despair. I know this is very difficult to understand, Declan, the officer said, trying to calm him. But what happened was a terrible accident. We're here to make sure you're safe and that someone takes care of you. Lies! You're lying. My dad will come back. He always comes back, Declan shouted, backing into the house. Tears began streaming down his face, and he ran up the stairs, ignoring the calls of the officer and the servants. Inside his room, Declan slammed the door shut with a forceful click of the lock, echoing as a reminder that he was alone. He flung himself onto the bed, burying his face in the pillow as sobs tore at his throat. The pillow muffled the sounds, but did nothing to contain the avalanche of thoughts and emotions that consumed him. The officer's words echoed repeatedly in his mind, each repetition like an invisible blow. Your father didn't make it. No! It can't be true, Declan cried out, his voice muffled by the pillow. He clutched the fabric tightly as if he could squeeze out the comfort he so desperately needed, but all he felt was emptiness. How could someone so strong, so unbreakable as his father, simply disappear? Derek had always been the pillar of everything, the man who made promises and kept them, who never let him down, always. Declan sat up in bed, his trembling hands holding the video game controller that Derek had promised to discuss with him that night. He stared at the object, his teary eyes turning it into a blur. You promised, he whispered, his voice broken, filled with pain. You said you'd be here, that we'd play together. His anger began to grow, the sadness giving way to a feeling of injustice that he didn't know how to control. With a scream, he hurled the controller against the wall, watching it shatter into pieces. The sound of shattering plastic seemed to muffle Declan's breath for a moment. He looked at the scattered pieces on the floor, and instead of feeling relieved, he felt a wave of guilt. It was as if even that object had become a precious reminder of Derek, and now he had destroyed it. Sorry, Dad, he muttered, pulling his knees against his chest and wrapping his arms around them. The room seemed bigger than ever, the silence only interrupted by the hurried footsteps of the staff outside. They spoke in whispers, but Declan could catch words like funeral, family, and sorrow. Each word felt like a stab to his heart. He clamped his ears, trying to block out the sounds, but they kept coming, piercing his mind like needles. He'll come back, Declan repeated to himself, his voice barely audible. He always comes back. It was like a mantra he needed to believe, as if saying those words enough times could change reality. He'll walk through that door, hug me, and say it was just a mistake. He never breaks promises. But for the first time, Declan began to feel a shadow of doubt. A small, painful part of him began to accept what he tried so hard to reject. This time, his father wouldn't be coming back. The tears returned with force, streaming freely down Declan's face as he curled up further on the bed. He looked at the clock on the wall, watching the hours that seemed not to pass. Why did it take so long, he muttered. If he had come back sooner, if he hadn't gone. His mind spun, searching for answers that didn't exist, trying to find someone to blame, a reason, something to explain the loss that seemed so absurd. Gradually, exhaustion began to overtake Declan. His eyes grew heavy, but he fought against sleep, as if fearing that closing his eyes meant accepting that Derek was no longer there. He looked at the slightly ajar closet door, where Derek's favorite jacket still hung. The sight brought a new lump to his throat, and he hugged the pillow even tighter. Dad, he whispered one last time before finally giving in to fatigue. Even as he slept, his tears continued to flow, and the mansion, now shrouded in darkness, seemed to reflect the emptiness that had taken over his heart. While Colton spoke, images of the bodies being removed from the building and the now empty meeting room were displayed on the screen. The narrative that was forming was clear. Miguel Herrera, allegedly pressured by debts and internal conflicts, would have put poison in the coffee with the aim of eliminating the other partners and taking full control of the project. The police had not yet officially confirmed this version, but the press was already treating it as a fait accompli. The reporter continued, "Are you recovering well, despite all of this? What was it like to be present at such a..." Devastating moment. Colton nodded slightly, placing his hand over his chest as if to show that he still felt the effects of the trauma. I'm recovering, but not just physically. Being there, seeing my friends fall one by one. It's something I'll never forget. It's an experience that has deeply marked me, but I believe we need to move on. What happened was terrible, but we need to take something positive from it, to honor those who are gone. The interview ended with Colton reinforcing his image as a determined survivor. As he thanked the medical team and the reporter for the opportunity to speak, the camera captured his seemingly shaken demeanor. It was the perfect portrait of a wounded but resilient man. Behind the scenes, however, Colton was already planning his next steps. Miguel's guilt was too convenient to ignore, and he knew how to manipulate the circumstances so that this version would be accepted without question. With Miguel out of the picture, no one could contest Colton's actions, and the restaurant, along with the entire empire he dreamed of building, was now within his reach. As the public watched the interview, moved by Colton's pain and determination, the truth remained buried beneath layers of manipulation. The man who was now being treated as a heroic victim had orchestrated everything with precision. The world believed the narrative he presented, while Colton moved forward relentless, building his legacy on the ashes of those he had betrayed. After the interview, Colton returned to his hospital room. He was exhausted, but satisfied. The interview had gone exactly as planned. The carefully chosen words, the tone of regret mixed with determination, and even the hospital setting, everything had been orchestrated to shape his image as a survivor and a hero. However, a twinge in his chest reminded him that his victory had not been entirely risk-free. As he adjusted the pillow on the hospital chair, the door opened softly, revealing the nurse who had been caring for him since his arrival. A woman with a professional expression but an attentive and inquisitive look, she entered, carrying a tray with medications and a bottle of water. "How are you feeling, Mr. Colton?" she asked, her voice calm but with a subtle tone of curiosity. "Much better, thanks to you and the hospital staff," Colton replied, flashing a controlled smile. He knew that every word needed to be measured, even in seemingly casual moments. The nurse approached the bed and began adjusting the equipment by his side. As she did so, she looked at Colton with a mixture of concern and interest. "It was a terrible situation you survived. The doctors are still surprised that your condition wasn't as severe as the others." Colton raised an eyebrow, trying to maintain his composure. "I guess I got lucky. Maybe fate decided I still have something to do around here," he said, with a tone that mixed irony and false modesty. The nurse laughed lightly, but her eyes didn't leave Colton's. "Maybe, but the blood test revealed traces of the same compound that was found in the coffee, just in a much smaller amount, almost as if someone knew exactly what they were doing." Colton felt a chill run down his spine, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his fingers crossed on his lap. "And what does that mean exactly?" "It means you were exposed, but not enough to put your life at real risk," the nurse replied, watching his reaction closely. "Curious, don't you think? Everyone else had fatal doses, but you, just enough to feel the mild symptoms." Colton let out a short laugh that sounded almost genuine. "Curious indeed. Maybe I served myself the right coffee without realizing it." He paused, staring at the nurse. "Or maybe I really am lucky, who can say?" The nurse tilted her head slightly, as if considering something. "Or maybe you know more than you're saying, Mr. Colton. Don't worry, I'm not passing judgments. My job is to take care of patients, not ask questions that no one wants to answer." Colton narrowed his eyes for a moment, assessing the woman in front of him. She was perceptive, more than he would have liked, but her expression remained neutral, professional. He decided not to fuel suspicions. "I'm in the hands of excellent professionals like you." "That's all that matters now," he said with a calculated smile. "I just want to get out of here and honor the memory of my colleagues." The nurse nodded, but there was something in her eyes that said she didn't fully believe in Colton's innocence. As she adjusted the last monitor, she muttered, almost as if speaking to herself, "The body sometimes speaks louder than words. That's why we always observe the signs, even the most subtle ones." Colton didn't respond. He just watched her as she finished her work and left the room. As soon as the door closed, his smile faded, replaced by a somber expression. The nurse had said little, but her words were full of implications. She knew there was more behind the story. Colton leaned back in the bed, his eyes fixed on the white ceiling illuminated by the cold hospital lights. The silence of the room was almost deafening, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the heart monitor by his side. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to push away the slight dizziness that had been bothering him since he ingested the poisoned coffee. A calculated dose, he thought, his lips curving into an ironic smile. Just enough to appear a legitimate victim, to ensure that no one would suspect that he was behind it all. But the twinge in his chest, which surfaced from time to time, was an uncomfortable reminder that the risk had been real. He touched the area lightly, feeling his heart beat irregularly for a brief moment. Unexpected consequences, he muttered, almost as if mocking himself. Even the most meticulous plans come at a price, he thought. But still, looking at the final balance, he knew it had been worth it. She can suspect all she wants, Colton muttered, his eyes narrowing. The nurse had been careful with her words, but he had managed to read between the lines. But suspicions prove nothing, and no one will believe her without evidence. He let out a heavy sigh, feeling momentarily secure, but not entirely relieved. Doubt is a dangerous weapon in the wrong hands, he reflected, clenching his fists slightly. Meanwhile, outside the room, the nurse walked down the hallway, her hands occupied with a chart, but her mind stuck on Colton's words and behavior. There was something about him that didn't match the role of victim everyone was so willing to accept. He knows what happened, she thought, noting Colton's vital signs details. She paused for a moment, frowning. He's hiding something. But what? She remembered the slight tremor in his voice when she mentioned the coffee and the quick glance he cast towards the door, as if to make sure no one was listening. It wasn't the common behavior of someone who had supposedly survived an attack. It was the behavior of someone who was still playing a game. But maybe he has also discovered that nothing stays hidden forever, the nurse muttered, as she closed the chart and proceeded down the hall. She knew it wasn't her place to make judgments, but something about that man deeply unsettled her. Perhaps it was his excessive calm, or perhaps it was the fact that while everyone else had succumbed, he had survived almost unscathed. Back in the room, Colton rolled in bed, trying to ignore the persistent pain radiating from his chest. That damned nurse is paying too much attention, he thought. I need to be careful. He knew that any mistake, any word or expression that slipped out of his control could begin to unravel everything he had built. He looked at the folder beside his bed, where the restaurant plans were carefully stored. It was more than just a project. It was the key to the empire he was determined to build. An empire that was now his alone. But for an instant, a shadow of doubt crossed his mind. Was it enough? Did I cover all the possibilities? Colton shook his head, trying to shake off the thought. There's no room for doubt, he said softly, as if convincing himself. He adjusted the pillows, leaning back again. The heart monitor beside him emitted a monotonous but reassuring sound. He knew time was on his side. With the narrative already planted in the media, and Miguel Herrera being pointed out as the culprit, it wouldn't take long for the truth he had fabricated to solidify. But deep down, a small unease persisted. It was like a muffled whisper, a reminder that even the greatest strategists could be undone by small details. Colton ignored it, focusing on his next steps. He had everything under control, or at least that's what he needed to believe. Years had passed since that fateful morning in the meeting room. Time, allied with the narrative meticulously constructed by Colton, took care of burying the suspicions and turning the tragic events into little more than a distant memory. Miguel Herrera, the deceased partner, had been officially identified as the one responsible for the poisoning. Police reports had found convincing evidence that Miguel was facing serious financial difficulties and internal disagreements with the other partners, which would have motivated his act of desperation. Colton, on the other hand, emerged as the resilient survivor, a symbol of overcoming and success. The restaurant, which he had promised to turn into a landmark, became a fever among the rich and powerful. Located in the heart of the city, the luxurious venture christened Vertice was now one of the country's most exclusive destinations. Celebrities, politicians, and tycoons vied for reservations months in advance to experience the perfect blend of haute cuisine and architectural exclusivity that Colton had envisioned. Vertice was not just a restaurant, but an experience. Every detail, From the impeccable design of the Italian marble tables to the personalized selection of rare wines, was designed to exude luxury. The menu, crafted by award-winning chefs, featured dishes that were works of art, and patrons did not hesitate to pay small fortunes for a dinner there. Colton had become an iconic figure. He was often seen at gala events, always impeccably dressed and surrounded by influential people. His interviews for renowned magazines portrayed him as a visionary who had turned a dream into reality, overcoming unimaginable adversities. No one dared to question the narrative he had established. Although time had erased the suspicions and consolidated Colton's legacy, inside him, the memories of the deadly meeting still lingered as a silent shadow. In moments of solitude, he was haunted by flashes of bodies dropping to the floor, expressions of horror, and the bitter taste of the poison he had ingested himself. But he always convinced himself that it had been necessary. It was me or them, he thought, justifying his actions as part of the inevitable price of success. Colton, however, knew that no matter how careful he was, the past was never completely buried. He had been investigated several times over the years, but had always emerged unscathed. Records had been manipulated, key witnesses influenced, and any trace that could incriminate him had been meticulously erased. Each new investigation only reinforced the narrative that Miguel had been the culprit, and Colton, the survivor. On a gala night at the Vertex, Colton walked through the main hall, personally greeting the most important clients. The atmosphere was vibrant, with soft music playing in the background, and the sound of clinking crystal glasses echoing through the hall. He watched with pride the fascinated faces of the guests, all enchanted by the perfection of the restaurant. "Mr. Colton, it's always an honor to dine here," said a tech mogul, shaking his hand enthusiastically. "This place is unique. There's nothing else like it." Colton smiled, nodding slightly. "I greatly appreciate your words. My goal has always been to create something that transcends the ordinary. It's a joy to see that we've managed to achieve that." As he conversed, his gaze was drawn to a large mural on the main wall of the restaurant. On it were inscribed the names of the founding partners of the Vertex, including Miguel and the others, who had died on that day. "In memory of those who dreamed big and paved the way for excellence," the inscription read. It was a tribute that Colton knew was hypocritical, but which served as a perfect shield against any lingering suspicions. The restaurant was just the beginning. Colton used the success of the Vertex as a springboard to expand his empire. He invested in hotels, wineries, and sustainability projects, building a network of ventures that made him even more powerful. He was now an admired public figure, an example of how to turn adversities into opportunities. But at night, when silence finally took hold of his luxurious penthouse, Colton still felt the weight of the past. He knew he had conquered the world, but the price of victory was carrying the ghosts of those he betrayed. No matter how much time passed, he could never completely erase the memory of those coffee cups that, in an instant, forever changed the course of his life. Colton looked out at the horizon through the window of his penthouse, with the stunning view of the illuminated city. He held a glass of wine in one hand, while the other gently touched the cold glass. "It was all worth it," he murmured to himself, as if he needed to convince the last part of his conscience that still dared to question. Then he toasted his reflection in the window, a man who had everything, but who knew that with every step taken towards the future, he carried the dark weight of the past. The hospital was a place of constant movement. People came and went, carrying stories of pain, hope, and sometimes redemption. Declan, now 25 years old, walked through the corridors with quick, confident strides. He wore the nurse's uniform with pride, the same profession he had chosen as a way to honor the memory of Derek, his father. After years of overcoming loss, he had found a purpose, to care for those who, like him once, needed someone to lend a hand. That afternoon, as he organized files at the reception, Declan noticed something that deeply disturbed him. On the other side of the corridor, an attendant was arguing with a visibly debilitated man. The vagrant, in tattered, soiled clothes, clutched his stomach with one hand while trying to explain something. He had a gaunt face and sunken eyes, but his gaze was full of desperation. "I already told you this is no place for vagrants. Go find help somewhere else," the attendant said, her voice laden with disdain. "This is a hospital, not a shelter." The man took a step back, clearly humiliated, and began mumbling something incomprehensible. Declan, who was watching the scene, felt his blood boil. He dropped the papers on the counter and quickly walked over to the attendant. "This is a hospital, isn't it?" "A place where we care for people, no matter who they are," Declan said, his voice firm but controlled. He positioned himself between the woman and the man, facing her with a look that left no room for discussion. "You have no right to treat anyone like that. Declan, he doesn't even have identification. He's probably just here to ask for money or food," the attendant retorted, crossing her arms. "We have protocols, and protocols don't justify humiliating someone who clearly needs help," Declan interrupted, his voice now louder. He turned to the vagrant, bending down slightly to be at his level. "Sir, what happened? Are you feeling unwell?" The man hesitated for a moment, as if he didn't believe someone actually cared. Finally, he answered in a feeble voice, "I have a lot of stomach pain. It's been days since I've eaten properly, and I think I ate something spoiled." Declan nodded, placing a comforting hand on the man's shoulder. "It's okay, we'll take care of it. Come with me." He cast one last disapproving look at the attendant before leading the man to an examination room. Inside the room, Declan helped the man sit on the examination table and began to carefully examine him. He asked simple questions, trying to better understand the man's condition. Meanwhile, the man looked at Declan with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "Why are you helping me? No one ever cares," the vagrant murmured, his voice trembling. Declan paused for a moment, looking into the man's eyes. "Because everyone deserves care and respect. You're a person, and that's enough for me." As he prepared an IV to hydrate the man, Declan felt a wave of emotions. He remembered his father, how Derek had helped a hungry woman on the street even in a moment of haste. The memory brought a comforting warmth to Declan's chest, a confirmation that he was on the right path. "My mother taught me to never ignore someone in need," Declan said, skillfully inserting the needle into the man's arm. "And my dad. He always said that small actions can make a big difference. I think they'd be proud to see me today." The man closed his eyes for a moment, tears slowly rolling down his face. "Thank you, Declan. I don't know how I'll pay for this, but thank you." Declan gently squeezed the man's shoulder. "You don't need to pay anything. Just take care of yourself, and when you're better, maybe help someone who needs it in whatever way you can." It was a quiet afternoon at the hospital, the kind of calm Declan knew never lasted long. He was in the hallway organizing medications when he heard a deafening sound coming from the street. A crash of colliding metal and desperate screams echoed through the place. Declan ran to the window and saw the scene. A car had lost control and collided with a motorcycle. Two bodies were lying on the asphalt, while pedestrians gathered around, some trying to help, others just watching in horror. Without hesitation, Declan dropped what he was doing and ran outside. When he arrived at the scene, he saw that the motorcyclist, a young woman, was conscious but crying and holding her bleeding leg. The car driver was unconscious, his head resting on the steering wheel, a trickle of blood running down his forehead. "I'm a nurse! Give me some space!" Declan shouted, kneeling beside the young woman. "Can you hear me? What's your name?" The young woman, her voice trembling, answered, "Fernanda, my leg. It hurts so much." "I know, Fernanda. I'll help you, okay? But we need to get you both inside the hospital," he said, glancing quickly at the unconscious car driver. Declan signaled for some pedestrians to help carry the unconscious man. "He needs immediate attention. Let's take him now." With the help of some volunteers, Declan managed to bring the two injured people to the hospital entrance. He pushed the doors open forcefully, shouting, "We need a stretcher here. We have two accident victims from the street." The receptionist looked at him, confused, before shaking her head. "Do they have health insurance or any proof of payment?" she asked, her voice dripping with indifference. "Health insurance? They've just been in a serious accident. They can't even answer that right now," Declan replied, indignant. "Their lives are at risk. We need to act fast." "Declan, you know how it works," the receptionist said coldly. "Without payment guarantees, we can't release the hospital's resources. You can stabilize them out here if you want, but full treatment. Only with proper procedures." Declan felt the blood rush to his face. "This is inhumane. We're talking about severely injured people, and all you can think about is money. They could die." At that moment, one of the doctors passed through the hallway and overheard the argument. He approached, adjusting his lab coat, and quickly glanced at the injured. Without cost coverage, there's nothing we can do. It's hospital policy, Declan. You didn't make the rules. Then change the damned rules, and Declan shouted, his tone now laced with frustration and pain. You swore to save lives, not negotiate who deserves to live or die. These people are here, they need us, and you're just going to ignore them. The doctor sighed, shaking his head. Take them to a public hospital, Declan. This is not the place for that. Declan looked at the pale faces of the injured, and then at the indifferent faces of his colleagues. He felt a knot tighten in his throat. You're breaking everything this profession stands for, he said, his voice lower but filled with contempt. If this is how you choose to live, then I can't be a part of it. He crouched down next to the young woman again, holding her hand. I'll take care of you, Fernanda. I won't leave you alone. Someone help me get them to an ambulance or somewhere they can be treated. With the help of bystanders, Declan managed to get the injured into a private car. He took one last look at the hospital's reception, where the receptionist and the doctor watched the scene without moving a muscle. Deep down, Declan knew that moment would change everything. He could no longer ignore the flawed system and the coldness with which so many lives were treated. As the car headed towards the nearest public hospital, Declan squeezed Fernanda's hand. I promise I'll fight for you, he said, his eyes shining with determination. Even if no one else does, I will. Inside the car, Declan did his best to keep Fernanda conscious. He held the young woman's hand, feeling the weak squeeze of her fingers as she tried to stay awake. Stay with me, Fernanda. We're almost there, he said, trying to hide the urgency in his voice. The driver of the private car drove as fast as possible, but the heavy traffic made it difficult to progress. Fernanda tried to respond, but her voice was only a whisper. It's all getting dark, she murmured, her eyes starting to close. No, stay with me, Fernanda. Breathe deeply, just focus on me, Declan pleaded, putting his hand on her pulse to check her heart rate. He felt his blood run cold when he realized the beats were getting weaker. Damn it! Come on, faster! He shouted to the driver, who was already driving as quickly as possible. Declan turned his attention back to the driver of the car, trying to stay calm. He knew deep down that time was against them. Not much longer, Fernanda. Please stay with me. Your family needs you. You're going to make it through this. But Fernanda started to lose control, and her head lolled slightly to the side. Declan gently shook her, trying to bring her back. Don't close your eyes. Talk to me, Fernanda. Say anything. The driver shouted, We're almost there. But before they could reach the public hospital, Fernanda took one last breath. The sound echoed in Declan's mind as an empty sound, one he knew he would never forget. He put 2 fingers to her neck, feeling the absence of a pulse. His eyes widened in horror. No, please, no, he screamed, his voice breaking in despair. He tried to resuscitate her in the car, pressing Fernanda's chest repeatedly, counting out loud as if it could convince her to fight a little longer. 1, 2, 3. Breathe, Fernanda. You can do it. Please, breathe. But nothing happened. The young woman remained motionless, and Declan felt an overwhelming wave of failure and helplessness wash over him. He rested his head on the car seat, his hands trembling as tears flowed freely down his face. Why? Why did this happen? She was alive. She had a chance, he murmured, his voice filled with pain. The car pulled up in front of the public hospital, but it was too late. The attendants came running, but Declan could only mumble, She didn't make it. We lost her on the way. He got out of the car, his steps heavy and his gaze lost. Every moment of that journey seemed etched in his mind, like a nightmare he couldn't shake. The image of Fernanda's face, the sound of her last breath, the squeeze of her hand, it all came back in painful flashes. As the attendants took Fernanda's body inside, Declan stood on the sidewalk, staring at the ground. His breathing was heavy, and he felt as if the entire world had collapsed on him. Guilt weighed on his chest like a stone. She could have lived, he muttered to himself, his eyes fixed on the asphalt. If we had attended to her at the hospital, if they hadn't denied her help. He punched the car with force, the pain in his heart spilling over into anger and despair. This isn't fair. This isn't how it's supposed to happen. It wasn't meant to be like this. He shouted, tears still streaming down his face. Declan knew that in that moment he had lost not only a patient, but a piece of himself. The tragedy was a cruel reminder of the flaws in the system, of the decisions that put money above lives. And as he sat on the curb trying to make sense of it all, a grim determination began to form in his heart. He couldn't change what had happened, but he vowed to himself that he would fight to prevent another life from being lost like this. Even amid the pain, Declan knew he had to keep going. He couldn't give up, not now. Because for him, caring for people wasn't just a profession, it was all he had. Declan returned to the hospital with his face marked by exhaustion and grief. His hands still trembled as he held the medical records he had left behind before rushing to aid Fernanda. Each step through the corridors seemed to weigh a ton, and the looks from his colleagues only increased his anguish. He knew many disapproved of his attitude of defying the system, but he never expected that tragedy to follow him there. As soon as he entered the break room to try to recompose himself, the supervisor, a man with a stern demeanor and authoritarian posture, appeared at the door with a cold look. "Declan, I need to speak with you." "Now," he said in a dry tone that left no room for discussion. Declan nodded slowly, taking a deep breath before following the supervisor to the conference room. He already imagined what was to come, but a part of him still hoped in vain for some understanding. Upon entering the room, he found other members of the administration seated around the table. Their expressions were neutral, but there was a rigidity in their gazes that made him feel judged before even saying anything. "Declan, we know what happened out there," the supervisor began as he sat in the central chair. "You disregarded the hospital's protocols by removing patients without proper authorization and tried to force the staff to attend to people who were not within the established criteria." Declan, still standing, clenched his fists tightly. "I disregarded the protocols? I tried to save lives. That young woman could be alive now if we hadn't wasted time arguing over bureaucratic and insensitive rules." The supervisor leaned forward, pressing his hands on the table. "The rules exist for a reason, Declan. This is a private hospital. We cannot simply attend to people who cannot pay. You know that." "I know the oath we took said nothing about anyone's bank balance," Declan retorted, his voice rising. "I know we let a young woman die because we refused to act when she needed help. That's what your rules did." "Enough," interrupted the supervisor, his voice cutting. "You've been warned before about acting impulsively. This hospital demands discipline, Declan, and you clearly don't understand that. Your attitude is admirable, but we cannot allow your rebelliousness to jeopardize the reputation and operation of this institution." Declan felt his blood boil. "Reputation? Operation? We're talking about human lives, but of course for you it all comes down to money and image, doesn't it?" The supervisor shook his head, as if trying to keep his composure. "This is not personal, Declan. You're a good nurse, but clearly not compatible with this hospital's philosophy. Therefore, we've decided your stay here is no longer viable. You're fired." The words hit Declan like a blow. He stood motionless for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard. "Fired?" he muttered, incredulous. "You're firing me for trying to save a life?" "We're firing you because your actions put the hospital's structure at risk," the supervisor replied, standing up. "We've already prepared the termination documents. You can sign them at the reception before leaving." Declan felt the indignation growing within him, but there was something deeper that prevented him from reacting. The weight of Fernanda's loss, which still echoed in his mind. He knew arguing wouldn't change anything at that moment. Without saying another word, he turned his back and left the room. In the corridor, curious glances and whispered murmurs from colleagues followed him as he walked to his locker. He gathered his few belongings, tucked them into a backpack, and with a heavy heart left the hospital that had been his world for so many years. As he exited through the main entrance, Declan paused for a moment and looked back. The hospital's gleaming facade seemed ironically indifferent, like a stone monument to everything he could not accept. "They may have taken me out of here, but they'll never take away my will to fight," he thought. His gaze fixed on the horizon, Declan let out a long sigh. He knew the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew he needed to keep going. For Fernanda's memory, for all the lives that never had a chance, and for the promise he had made to himself never to give up. The days after his dismissal turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Without a steady job, insufficient savings, and few people to turn to, Declan soon found himself in a situation he had never imagined living. sleeping on park benches and scrounging for food scraps in trash cans. The young man who once strode confidently through the hospital corridors now wandered the streets, wearing tattered clothes and carrying the weight of a world that seemed to have abandoned him. On that morning, Declan was sitting in a dirty corner of a busy sidewalk, his face obscured by a frayed hood. He held a small makeshift sign, scrawled with a piece of charcoal on a scrap of cardboard, "Hungry. Any help welcome." His eyes were downcast, avoiding the gazes of hurried passers-by, many of whom hardly even noticed him. A middle-aged woman walked past him, carrying shopping bags. She paused for a moment, looking at Declan with an expression of disdain. "Why don't you get a job instead of sitting here bothering people?" she said, before moving on without waiting for a response. Declan felt his face flush with shame, but he remained silent. He knew that responding would only make things worse. A little later, a group of teenagers passed by him, laughing and talking loudly. One of them stopped, picked up a coin and tossed it on the ground, making it roll until it stopped near Declan. "Hey, beggar, want some money?" "You'll have to pick it up from the ground," the youth shouted, as his friends laughed and gave Declan a light kick with their feet. Declan looked at them, his eyes filled with a mix of humiliation and anger, but again remained silent. He slowly bent down to retrieve the coin, feeling tears threaten to spill, but forcing himself to swallow his pride. He knew he needed that coin, no matter how small. With the little he managed to scrape together, Declan bought a piece of bread from a nearby bakery. As he ate slowly, trying to savor every bite as if it were a full meal, the clerk looked at him with disdain. "You can't stay here." "You'll scare away the customers," the man said, pointing toward the door. Declan rose without a word, taking the remnants of the bread with him. He walked to a nearby alleyway and sat on the cold ground, leaning against the wall. He stared at the piece of bread in his hands, and for a moment felt lost. How had he, who had dedicated his life to caring for others, ended up in this state? Would my father be ashamed of me now? He thought, biting into the bread with effort to keep from crying. That night the temperature dropped sharply. Declan found shelter under the awning of a closed shop, but the icy wind seemed to cut through his tattered clothes. He huddled against the wall, trying to warm himself with his arms crossed over his chest. The sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the distance, but no one stopped to look at him. The next day, as he wandered the street, Declan tried asking a well-dressed man leaving an upscale restaurant for help. "Sir, could you help me with some food? I haven't eaten anything today," he said, his voice low and hesitant. The man stopped and looked Declan up and down. "You're young, healthy. You shouldn't be out here begging. Go work like everyone else," he replied coldly, before getting into a luxury car and driving off. Declan stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of those words. He knew it wasn't fair, but the world didn't seem to care. He looked at his soiled hands and the clothes that no longer shielded him from the cold. For the first time, he felt something akin to giving up. He sat down on a corner, his face hidden in his hands as silent tears streamed down his cheeks. Declan, who had once vowed to care for others, now saw himself as a shadow of his former self, facing the same kind of rejection he had always fought against. And there, amidst the bustling city, he realized the world could be cruel even to those who had once been its heroes. It was a busy night in the city, and the Virtus restaurant shone like a beacon of luxury and exclusivity. Declan, now unrecognizable after months living on the streets, stopped in front of the ornately decorated entrance to the restaurant. He had heard of the place before, knew of its reputation, and the wealthy patrons who frequented the establishment. But more than that, the name of the restaurant brought a bitter memory, the name of the project his father, Derek, had mentioned before his death. "My father was supposed to be here. He should have been one of the owners of this," thought Declan, feeling a mix of pain and indignation. He stared at the imposing facade for a few minutes before mustering the courage to enter. Maybe I'll find answers. Maybe I'll find justice. Declan pushed the glass doors cautiously, entering the luxurious environment. The smell of sophisticated dishes mingled with the sound of silver cutlery and muffled conversations. The contrast with the reality he lived was almost surreal. The well-dressed people, the impeccable waiters, and the ostentatious decor seemed from another world. However, as soon as Declan took his first steps into the hall, the glances began. Customers frowned, whispering among themselves while employees approached with disapproving expressions. "Sir, what are you doing here?" asked one of the waiters in a firm tone. "This is a private establishment." "I think you're in the wrong place." Declan took his first steps into the hall, but the opulence around him was quickly replaced by looks of disdain. Well-dressed customers frowned and began to whisper among themselves, while waiters exchanged uncomfortable glances. The contrast between him, with his worn and dirty clothes, and the impeccably decorated environment could not be greater. "Sir, what are you doing here?" asked one of the waiters in a firm tone, trying to hide his discomfort. "This is a private establishment. I think you are in the wrong place." Declan, with a trembling voice and downcast eyes, replied, "I just want a plate of food. I haven't eaten anything today, please. Anything." The waiter hesitated, looking around as if seeking support. Before he could respond, a woman at a nearby table let out a loud, disdainful laugh. "Look at that! A beggar at Vertis! That's unbelievable!" Laughter echoed through the hall, while Declan remained motionless, clenching his fists tightly to contain the shame growing inside him. "Please," he insisted, raising his eyes to the waiter. "Just a plate. I'm not asking for anything else." Before the waiter could decide what to do, a firm voice laden with authority cut through the environment. "What's going on here?" All eyes turned to Colton, who descended the main staircase with calculated steps. Wearing an impeccable suit, he seemed the embodiment of power and control. His eyes fixed on Declan, quickly sizing him up and down. "Mr. Colton," the waiter began, nervous. "This man. He came in asking for food. Said he's hungry." Colton tilted his head slightly, his lips curving into a cold smile. "Food? Here? Do you have any idea where you are, my dear?" He approached Declan, who felt the weight of the stairs and the oppression of Colton's presence. I'm just hungry," Declan replied, trying to remain calm. "I don't have money, but anything you can give me." Colton let out a short, humorless laugh. "Hunger? Of course. But this is not the place for that, boy. Here people pay dearly for the experience. You can't just show up and expect us to feed, well, people like you." Declan tried to argue, but the words were lost when Colton extended his hand to a waiter. "Bring him something," he ordered, his voice laden with sarcasm. "Let's solve this now." A few minutes later, the waiter returned with a plate of leftovers, food that had been removed from the tables and grotesquely mixed. Colton took the plate and walked up to Declan, looking him straight in the eye. "You want food? Here it is," said Colton, as he threw the contents of the plate over Declan. Zor stripped down his worn clothes. Pieces of bread and meat clung to his chest. As the hall erupted in laughter. "Now get out of here before I have security throw you out." Declan stood motionless for a moment, feeling the smell of the scraps that now covered his clothes. His vision blurred with tears, but he fought to keep them contained. The laughter and whispers around him seemed to echo in his mind as a cruel reminder of his humiliation. He looked up at Colton, who gazed back at him with a satisfied smile. Without a word, Declan turned and walked towards the door. His dignity was in tatters, but within him a flame of determination began to burn. "They may think I'm just a nobody, but I'll prove them wrong." As soon as he left the restaurant, Declan stopped on the sidewalk, taking deep breaths to hold back the sobs. He looked at the illuminated building, its glass walls reflecting the opulent light from inside. He knew he needed to keep fighting, because at that moment, he wasn't just fighting hunger or humiliation, he was fighting to regain his own humanity. The next morning, Declan, still feeling the weight of the previous day's humiliation, found himself standing in front of the Vertex restaurant once again. The luxurious glimmer of the glass windows and the constant flow of well-dressed patrons entering and leaving drew him like a magnet. He didn't know exactly why he had returned. Perhaps it was desperation for answers, or the desire to prove something to himself. But something inside him made him stay there. As he lingered discreetly near the entrance, trying not to draw attention, a security guard noticed his presence. The man crossed his arms, frowning. "Hey, you again? What do you think you're doing here?" Declan looked up, hesitant but determined to try once more. "I just want to talk to someone. I'm not asking for anything. Just a few minutes." The guard let out a dry laugh. "A few minutes? You think this is the kind of place where a beggar can walk in and ask for a few minutes?" He took a few steps towards Declan, who instinctively backed away. "Yesterday was enough. Get out of here before we have to remove you by force." Meanwhile, some arriving patrons observed the scene, whispering among themselves. A woman let out a little laugh, turning to the man beside her. "That same guy? He must be obsessed. Maybe we should give him a few coins so he'll go away." The words cut deep into Declan, but he stood firm. "I don't want coins. I just need—" Before he could finish, another security guard appeared. This one grabbed Declan by the arm, pulling him away from the entrance. "Enough. You don't belong here. I don't know why you keep coming back. Go look somewhere you actually have a chance of getting something." As he was dragged away, Declan heard more laughter coming from inside the restaurant. He tried to break free of the guard's grip, but it was too strong. "Please, I just want to talk to someone. I'm not here to cause trouble." "You're already causing trouble," the guard said, shoving Declan until he fell to his knees on the sidewalk. "Don't come back here or we'll call the police next time." Declan remained on the ground for a moment, feeling the stares of passers-by and patrons upon him. The tears threatened to fall again, but he held them back. With no strength left to argue, he slowly got up and walked away, shoulders hunched and head down. That night, Declan found a dark corner under an awning to sleep. The biting cold and constant noise of the city made it impossible to relax, but he was too exhausted to care. He huddled against the wall, hugging his knees, as the memory of food being thrown at him the previous day and the humiliation of being dragged away today echoed in his mind. "Why is this happening to me?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. He looked up at the sky where the stars were almost invisible among the city lights and squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push back the tears. "I just wanted to help people. Why did it all turn into this?" The sound of nearby footsteps made him open his eyes for a moment, but no one stopped to look at him. Declan let out a long sigh and leaned his head back against the wall. The hunger, the cold, and the loneliness were unbearable, but what hurt most was the feeling that the world had given up on him. He fell asleep to the distant sound of sirens, his last words a desperate whisper. "Father, help me." Declan was huddled under the awning, eyes closed, when he felt a presence nearby. He slowly opened his eyes to see an older woman standing before him. She wore simple but clean clothes, and her eyes were kind, though they seemed to carry the weight of many years of life. Her face was gently illuminated by the faint light of a nearby street lamp. "Are you all right, son?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Declan hesitated, still confused by the interrupted sleep. I'm fine. Just need to rest," he replied, his voice hoarse and weak. The woman crouched down, leveling with him. "Resting in the cold, hungry. That's not rest, that's surviving. My name is Evelyn, and I'm not going to let you spend another night like this." Declan looked at her with distrust. "Why? Why do you care? No one else seems to care." Evelyn gave a small, empathetic smile. "Because I've seen this before. I've seen people fall, lose everything, and I've seen what happens when no one is there to help them up. Come with me. I have a simple place, but it's warm. And you can have something to eat." Declan hesitated. He didn't know this woman, and the world had shown him how cruel it could be. But there was something in her eyes, an honesty he hadn't seen in a long time. Finally, he nodded and stood up, his legs wavering under the weight of exhaustion. Evelyn's house was small but cozy, with walls full of old photos and furniture that showed signs of use, but were well cared for. The smell of hot soup filled the air as soon as they entered, and Declan felt his stomach growl loudly. "Go, wash up in the bathroom. I'll prepare something for you to eat," said Evelyn, pointing to a door in the hallway. Declan did as she asked, washing his face and hands in the small bathroom. He looked at himself in the cracked mirror and almost didn't recognize the man he saw. His eyes were sunken, his beard unkempt, and his face marked by dirt and fatigue. When he returned, Evelyn had already set a steaming bowl of soup on the table. "Sit and eat, slowly so you don't get sick," she said, sitting across from him. Declan ate the soup in silence, savoring every spoonful as if it were the best meal he'd ever had. When he finished, Evelyn watched him with an evaluating gaze, as if trying to decide what to say. "You mentioned something about your father," she began gently. "Who was he?" Declan looked at her, surprised by the question. "My father was Derek. He died years ago, poisoned at a meeting with his partners. He believed in that restaurant, in the project, but something went wrong and he died." Evelyn took a deep breath, her expression hardening slightly. "Derek. I remember him. And the others." Declan tensed. "You. Remember? How so?" "I was a nurse," Evelyn explained, clasping her hands on the table. "I worked at the hospital where your partner's bodies were taken. I analyzed their blood, the reports, and I also saw something I shouldn't have seen." Declan leaned forward, his curiosity now fully piqued. "What did you see?" Evelyn hesitated for a moment before continuing. "There was poison in their bodies. A rare poison. Not something easily found. But what caught my attention was another detail. The reports. Someone tried to alter the results to make it seem like it was all an accident or something related to Miguel, the partner who was incriminated. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Colton's poison dose was lower than the others." "You knew and didn't say anything?" Declan asked, his voice laden with emotion. "Back then, I had no power, boy," Evelyn replied sadly. "I tried, I even questioned Colton, but he bought off the whole hospital, the doctors, the nurses to make his narrative stronger, and then they pushed me off the case. They said I was meddling where I shouldn't. Someone who would do anything to cover up the truth." Declan felt his heart race. "Colton, he was there. He survived." Evelyn nodded slowly. "He was the only one who came out practically unscathed. He was never truly investigated. Everything was pinned on Miguel, but I always knew there was more to it." Declan clenched his fists, feeling a mix of anger and determination. "I need to uncover the truth. I need to make him pay for what he did." Evelyn looked at him for a long moment before standing up. "If you're willing to fight for this, I'll help you. But know that it won't be easy. People like Colton have many resources and know how to cover their tracks." Declan nodded, his eyes gleaming with a new flame. "I have nothing left to lose. I'll fight until the end." Evelyn put a hand on his shoulder, her gaze firm and supportive. "Then rest. Tomorrow we begin." As Declan lay on the simple couch with a warm blanket over him, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. He knew the road would be long and dangerous, but for the first time, he wasn't alone. And now, with Evelyn by his side, he was determined to bring the truth to light. Declan returned to the streets, blending into the crowd as just another of the invisible. The beggar's life, which was once a condition imposed by hopelessness, now became his best tool for investigating Colton and his restaurant. Wearing even more tattered clothes, he prowled around Vertex every day, observing the movements of those who came and went. Declan was careful, staying off the radar of security guards or employees who might recognize him. After weeks of observation, one figure caught his attention. A well-dressed man, always in an immaculate suit and shiny shoes, visited the restaurant frequently, but never stayed for long. He arrived discreetly, entered through a side entrance and left without fanfare. Declan decided he needed to find out more about him. That night, Declan positioned himself near the side entrance. When the man appeared, Declan hid in the shadows and waited until he came out again. As soon as the man left the restaurant and got into a black car, Declan followed on foot, keeping enough distance not to be noticed. The car drove a few blocks before stopping in front of a luxurious mansion, surrounded by high iron gates and dense vegetation. Declan immediately recognized the place. It was Colton's house. "So you're not just an important customer," Declan muttered to himself, hidden behind a tree across the street. He watched the man enter through the gates, being greeted by Colton himself. The two seemed quite comfortable with each other, exchanging quick greetings before disappearing inside the house. In the following days, Declan made Colton's mansion the new focus of his investigation. He slept in the surroundings, observing every movement, mentally noting the times and patterns. And as expected, the well-dressed man returned several times. Declan inched closer and closer to the property, until he finally managed to overhear fragments of their conversations through an open window. "We need to reinforce the narrative that Miguel was solely responsible. The last investigation has cooled down, but we can't risk another curious journalist," the well-dressed man said in a serious tone. His voice was firm, but not too loud. Declan leaned in to listen better, his heart racing as he caught the mention of Miguel, the deceased partner. Colton responded with a short, cold laugh. "That's already buried. No one's going to connect anything to me. But you're right. We need to make sure everything stays under control. Your job is to ensure any threat is neutralized before it even appears." "I'll take care of it," the man replied, before lowering his tone. Declan couldn't hear the rest of the conversation, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. Declan continued to observe, following the well-dressed man on several occasions. He discovered that the man was a personal advisor to Colton, someone who seemed responsible for protecting his interests and manipulating the public narrative in his favor. He came and went regularly, always carrying documents or leaving after long conversations. As Declan gathered information, the hatred and determination within him grew. Colton had not only escaped unpunished for the crime against his father, but he also continued to manipulate everything and everyone to protect his empire. That night, sitting on a park bench near the mansion, Declan took a deep breath. He knew he was getting close to the truth, but he also knew he needed more evidence. Just overhearing fragments of conversations wouldn't be enough to expose Colton and his advisor. "I'll get it," he whispered to himself, staring at the mansion in the distance. "I'll end this for my father and for everyone you've destroyed." With the plan still in the works, Declan retreated back into the shadows, determined to find the final piece that would reveal the whole truth. After weeks of constant observation, Declan developed an almost obsessive pattern of recording every movement at Colton's mansion. He knew the advisor visited regularly, always punctual, and that no one else other than the regular staff seemed to enter that place. However, on a particularly quiet night, a different black car pulled up in front of the property. A well-dressed man got out of the vehicle. His posture was rigid, and he carried a heavy-looking leather briefcase. Declan, hidden among bushes across the street, immediately noticed something strange. Unlike the advisor, this man seemed uncomfortable, looking around as if checking if he was being followed. Declan fixed his gaze, trying to capture every detail. The gate opened quickly, and the man was received by a staff member who led him directly inside the mansion. "He's not like the others," Declan thought. "He doesn't have the confidence of someone who comes and goes unnoticed." Declan waited until the main lights in the mansion dimmed. He crossed the street carefully, approaching the gate. On the side of the property, he found a half-open window near the garden. From his position, he could overhear parts of the conversation happening inside. "You shouldn't have come here directly," the advisor said in a harsh tone. "Keeping our communications discreet is part of the deal. This is basic." "I know," the well-dressed man replied, his voice low but tense. "But there was information that needed to be delivered in person. It's too sensitive to go through intermediaries." Colton, who until then had been silent, interrupted with an irritated tone. "Sensitive? More sensitive than the risk of someone noticing your visit here? I hope you know what you're doing, because I won't tolerate mistakes." Declan felt his heart racing. Who was that man? And what was he bringing that seemed so urgent? He leaned closer to the window, trying to catch more details. The counselor continued, now in a calmer but authoritative tone. "You were chosen for this because we trust that you won't slip up. Don't disappoint me. Do you realize the impact of this if something leaks?" The well-dressed man hesitated before answering. "I understand perfectly. That's why I'm here. But I must warn you that the situation is getting complicated. There are rumors resurfacing again about the partners' case." Colton let out a dry laugh. "Rumors will always exist. The difference is that we have control over the narrative. Do what was asked, and ensure no one has reason to connect this to me." Declan recoiled slightly, processing what he had just heard. It was clear that that man was an emissary, someone sent to deliver information or execute orders on behalf of the counselor and Colton, and the mention of the partners reignited his determination. Later that night, when the man left the mansion, Declan carefully followed him through the dark streets of the city. He knew he needed to find out more about him and his connection to Colton. The man entered a discreet building, and Declan managed to note the address before returning to his hideout. Sitting under the dim light of a street lamp, Declan recapped everything he had discovered up to that point. The counselor was at the center of the operation, manipulating information and sending agents to protect Colton. But now, with the presence of this new man, there was a chance for Declan to uncover something even bigger. If he's delivering sensitive information, then this could be my opportunity, thought Declan. Maybe this man is the link I need to expose Colton once and for all. He knew the journey was only beginning, but now with a new target in sight, he felt the truth was closer than ever. Declan returned to Evelyn's small apartment that same night, breathless and anxious, his thoughts jumbled by the information he had gathered. Evelyn, sitting at the kitchen table, looked at him with concern as he rushed in, still dirty and exhausted from the streets. "You look like you've seen a ghost," said Evelyn, getting up to place a cup of tea in front of Declan. "What happened this time?" Declan sat down, rubbing his face with his hands before starting to speak. "I saw a different man entering Colton's mansion. He's not like the counselor. He seemed tense, uncomfortable, like he knew he was carrying something important, and I heard them talking about rumors resurfacing, something related to my father's partners." Evelyn grew serious, leaning forward, her face etched with worry. "They're trying to protect what they did, Declan. This confirms that Colton is neck-deep involved. And this man, he could be the key piece to unravel it all." Declan nodded, but there was a tone of frustration in his voice. "I followed him to a building. I wrote down the address, but what can I do? I'm just a beggar now. Even if I confront him, no one would listen to me." Evelyn was silent for a moment, thinking deeply. Her eyes narrowed as an idea started to form. Maybe you don't need to be yourself, at least not the way they see you now." Declan frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" Evelyn stood up, crossing her arms as she spoke, her voice full of conviction. "What if you disguised yourself as someone from within their circle, as one of the counselor's trusted emissaries?" Declan blinked, surprised. "Disguise myself? You think that would work? How could I possibly fool someone like Colton?" Evelyn gave a small, determined smile. "It's not as impossible as it seems. You know how they act, how they behave. And you have something they underestimate, your ability to observe and adapt. With the right clothes, the right haircut, and a bit of practice, you could pass yourself off as someone Colton or the counselor would call an ally." Declan fell silent, processing the idea. "But what if they realize? What if this goes wrong?" Evelyn placed a hand on his shoulder, looking directly into his eyes. "Every mission has risks, Declan, but you've come this far. Do you want to expose the truth about your father's death or not?" He took a deep breath, finally nodding. "I do. More than anything." "Then we'll start tomorrow," Evelyn said, smiling slightly. "I still have contacts who can help us get the right clothes and details. We'll practice how you should speak, how you should behave, and with the address you wrote down, we can find out more about this man you followed. He could be your way into the inner circle." In the following days, Evelyn worked with Declan to transform him. She procured elegant clothes from a tailor she knew, helped him cut his hair and trim his beard, and spent hours with him practicing how to speak with confidence, how to use the tone of someone accustomed to giving orders. Declan, determined, absorbed it all like a sponge. "You are no longer the beggar they cast out," Evelyn said during one of the training sessions, as Declan practiced his posture in front of a mirror. "You are someone they would respect, someone they would listen to." When they finally felt ready, Evelyn handed Declan a small piece of paper with information she had obtained through her contacts. "This is the man you followed. He is an emissary of the counselor. If you approach him and convince him you work for Colton, he will open the doors for you." Declan looked at the paper, the name and address etched into his mind. "I'm ready," he said, his voice firm. "For my father and for everyone Colton has destroyed." "Good luck," Evelyn replied, her voice laden with pride and worry. "And remember, trust your determination. You've survived far more than this." With the plan in mind and his new identity assumed, Declan set out on his boldest mission yet. He knew the danger was great, but the chance to finally expose the truth and bring justice was worth every risk he was about to take. Declan took a deep breath before knocking on the large wooden door of Colton's mansion. Dressed in an impeccable suit, with neatly trimmed hair and confident posture, he looked like a completely different person. Evelyn was right. The transformation was essential, and Declan needed to believe his own deception for others to believe it too. The door was opened by a staff member who briefly appraised him before speaking. "Can I help you? My name is Declan. I'm one of the counselor's trusted emissaries. I have important matters to discuss with Colton." "He's expecting me," Declan said, his voice firm but polite. The staff member hesitated for a moment, then nodded and led him through the luxurious foyer. With every step, Declan felt his heart racing. He knew this was his chance, but any misstep could be fatal. When they reached Colton's office, The host was seated behind an immense wooden desk, a glass of whiskey in his hand. Colton looked up at Declan, his expression immediately growing tense. He cocked his head, as if trying to assess the man who had just entered. "Trusted emissary of the counselor?" Colton asked, slowly rising to his feet. His voice carried a tone of skepticism. "Interesting. Just how many trusted emissaries does he have after all? Because this is the first time I'm seeing you." Declan kept his composure, giving a small smile. "The counselor prefers to work with discretion. It's how we manage to keep the more delicate matters under control. I was sent to discuss some issues he considers sensitive. I thought you would have been informed." Colton narrowed his eyes, slowly walking around the desk. "Ah yes, this discretion. Of course, always him with these plays, but still it's odd. Why would he send someone new without warning me first?" Declan swallowed hard but kept the smile. "Because the rumors are resurfacing, Colton. He's concerned about leaks and thought it best to bring in someone from the outside. Someone who can work without raising suspicions. That's precisely why I'm here." Colton stopped in front of Declan, folding his arms. He appraised him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether he believed the story or not. Finally, he gave a brief, false smile. "Very well. Come in. Let's talk." Colton gestured for Declan to sit in one of the leather armchairs in front of his desk. He himself settled back into his chair, his gaze still distrustful. "So, tell me, what exactly does the counselor think is so sensitive that he needs an intermediary at this stage?" Colton asked, leaning his elbows on the desk and interlacing his fingers. Declan took a deep breath, maintaining the confident tone Evelyn had taught him. "The rumors about the restaurant partners have resurfaced. There are people asking what really happened at the meeting where Miguel was implicated. This is concerning, Colton. The counselor believes there may be a journalist or someone from the outside trying to connect the dots. I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen." Colton let out a soft, cold laugh that didn't match the gleam in his eyes. "Rumors. There are always rumors, Declan, and so far I've dealt with them just fine. Why is he so nervous now?" "Because the questions are getting more direct." "And because there are people who might know more than they should," Declan replied, leaning forward slightly as if to emphasize the gravity of the situation. "He believes you should review the containment strategies, and that's why I'm here." Colton fell silent for a few seconds, still watching Declan like a predator analyzing its prey. Then, with a slow motion, he picked up the glass of whiskey and took a sip. "All right, let's see what you have to say. But before anything else, I want you to tell me something. Why should I trust you? What's your story, Declan?" Declan felt his blood run cold for a moment, but quickly found an answer. "My story is simple. I am loyal to the counselor just like you, and my only mission is to ensure that your reputation and business remain intact. If you prefer, we can speak directly to him. I'm sure he will confirm who I am." Colton leaned back, looking intrigued. "Very well, Declan. I'll give you the benefit of the doubt for now. But know this, I do not tolerate betrayals, and if you're playing a game with me, it's going to end very badly for you." Declan kept his smile, but felt a chill run down his spine. "I'm not playing any games, Colton. I'm here to help you, and together we can make sure everything stays under control." Colton nodded slowly, but there was still something in his gaze that hinted at distrust. "Very well, then let's see how useful you can be." Declan knew he had gained a small opening, but he also realized he was walking on thin ice. Every word, every move had to be calculated. He couldn't fail now, not this close to the truth. Colton leaned back in the leather chair, slowly swirling the glass of whiskey between his fingers. The silence in the room was dense, only interrupted by the faint tinkling of the ice in the glass. He looked at Declan, his eyes narrowed like someone calculating every word. "You know," Colton began, his voice low and charged with tension, "it's been years since that incident. The media hardly talks about it anymore. People forget, you know. They just want their restaurants, their fancy wines, their perfect lives. But every now and then there's a whisper, a shadow that reminds me I'm not completely safe." Declan leaned slightly forward, feigning genuine interest. "What exactly are you afraid of, Colton? It seems you have everything under control." Colton let out a dry laugh, a sound that seemed more a sigh than a true expression of humor. "It's true, I have enough under control. The counselor ensures that. But there's one exception. One person who never accepted her place in the story. A woman. A former nurse. Declan felt his heart quicken. He knew exactly who Colton was talking about, but he kept his expression neutral. A nurse? Why would she be a threat? Colton took a sip of his whiskey, letting the liquid slide down his throat before answering. Because she knows more than she should. When it all happened, the order was clear. Erase any trace of doubt. We bought silence, deleted files, manipulated narratives. But this woman, Evelyn, that's her name, she didn't want the money. She said she couldn't be bought. Declan felt his fists tighten under the table, but he kept his voice calm. And she's still alive? After all these years? Colton set his glass down on the table with a dull thud, leaning forward. Yes, as far as I know, she is. But she's never gone too far. Perhaps she's become complacent. Perhaps she's afraid. But if she opens her mouth... He paused, his eyes glinting with something cold and relentless. If she says anything, I won't hesitate. She'll die, because no one, Declan, absolutely no one can threaten what I've built. Colton's words hit Declan like a blow, but he kept his composure, struggling to control the fury burning in his chest. It seems you're prepared for any eventuality, he said, carefully choosing his words. But what makes you think she still poses a threat after all these years? Colton leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Because people like her don't forget. They stay silent, waiting for an opportunity. And I've learned never to underestimate those who harbor resentment. Understood, said Declan, nodding slowly. If need be, I can help monitor her, ensure she doesn't get the chance to do anything. After all, that's what I'm here for. Colton gave a wry smile, though his eyes remained shadowed. Good answer, Declan, good answer. As Colton spoke of his sinister plans, Declan felt adrenaline coursing through his veins. The revelation that Colton still saw Evelyn as a threat only reinforced the gravity of the situation. He's willing to kill to protect what he's built, Declan thought. If he finds out Evelyn's helping, she'll be in real danger. Declan knew he needed to warn Evelyn immediately, but he also knew that the longer he remained in Colton's circle, the closer he would get to the full truth. He would have to be more cautious than ever. I'll do everything I can to help, said Declan, his voice calm but laced with hidden determination. He knew he was dealing with a dangerous man, but he also knew he couldn't turn back now. Each step brought him closer to justice or destruction. As soon as Colton left the office, striding toward the bathroom with firm steps, Declan took the moment. He waited until he heard the distant sound of the bathroom door closing before rising silently. His heart was pounding in his chest, but he knew this was his chance to find something important. Colton's office was meticulously organized, like the man who occupied it. The solid wood desk gleamed under the soft glow of the chandelier, and shelves filled with books and neatly aligned folders lined the walls. Declan knew he didn't have much time, so he started with the desk. He opened the first drawer, finding only pens, notebooks, and a few seemingly irrelevant documents. The second drawer held more important papers, business contracts, transaction receipts, and an agenda with notations that caught his eye. Declan flipped through the agenda quickly, trying to absorb as much information as possible. One name in particular stood out across several entries: counselor. There were times and dates for meetings, as well as vague notes like maintain control over rumors and monitor Evelyn's situation. Declan felt his blood run cold. He really is still monitoring her, he thought, anger growing within him. Upon opening the last drawer, Declan found a black folder with a discreet seal. He pulled it out carefully and opened it, finding a series of documents detailing financial transactions and records of encounters held before and after the death of the restaurant partners. Miguel's name was scribbled out in several places, as if he had been the scapegoat from the beginning. Among the papers, there was also a medical report, which Declan immediately recognized as part of the autopsy of the partners. The document had blatant signs of tampering, handwritten notes omitting mentions of poison and suggesting natural causes of death. Declan clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the truth before his eyes. He manipulated everything. Not only did he kill my father, but he made sure no one would ever suspect. Before he could continue examining the documents, Declan heard the sound of footsteps returning down the hallway. His heart raced. He quickly closed the folder, returning it to the drawer and closing everything back to the state he had found it. Sitting back down in the chair, He tried to control his breathing and appear calm. Colton entered the office, drying his hands with a cloth handkerchief. He looked at Declan for a moment, his eyes narrowed as if trying to catch something amiss. "I hope you didn't get bored while I was away," he said with a slightly distrustful tone. Declan smiled, though he felt sweat trickling down his neck. "Not at all. I was just thinking about the measures we can take to deal with the rumors. We have a lot to discuss." Colton nodded, returning to sit behind the desk. "Good, because there's no room for errors. Nothing can go wrong." While Colton spoke, Declan maintained an appearance of calm, but his mind was churning with the information he had found. He knew he needed to leave there with a plan, and quickly. The evidence was there, but removing it without raising suspicion would be a challenge. The truth was within reach, but he would need more courage and cunning than ever to use it against Colton. Declan knew every second counted. With Colton distracted by a phone call he had just received, he seized the moment to grab the black folder from the drawer. Moving swiftly, he hid it under the fitted blazer Evelyn had managed to get for him. His heart raced in his chest, but he took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure as he walked toward the exit. When Declan reached the hallway, he felt relief starting to set in. Almost there, he thought. However, upon turning the corner, he came face to face with a familiar figure, the counselor. The tall, imposing man in his perfectly tailored suit looked directly at Declan, his face neutral, but his eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here?" the counselor asked, his voice low but laced with authority. "I didn't send you here. Who the hell are you?" Declan's blood ran cold. He tried to maintain his composure, but noticed Colton had followed in his footsteps down the hall, stopping just behind him. "What's going on here?" Colton asked, his tone irritated. The counselor looked from Declan to Colton, his face starting to harden. "I didn't send anyone here, Colton. Who is this man?" Colton, now clearly suspicious, approached Declan. "You didn't tell me you worked directly for him? Then why doesn't he know who you are?" His eyes narrowed as he looked Declan up and down. Declan tried to improvise. "I was assigned through another channel. There may have been a misunderstanding, but I—" Before he could finish, Colton pulled at Declan's blazer, and the black folder fell to the floor between them with a revealing thud. The silence that followed was deafening. Colton looked at the folder, then at Declan, his eyes burning with anger. "You think you can trick me?" Colton roared, snatching the folder from the floor. He quickly opened it, confirming the incriminating documents were inside. "You were going to steal this? Who are you, really?" Declan took a step back, but before he could react, Colton signaled for two security guards who quickly appeared in the hallway. They grabbed Declan, immobilizing him as he struggled futilely to escape. "Take him up," Colton ordered, as the counselor watched with a serious yet intrigued expression. "I want answers now." Declan was dragged back into the office and tied to a chair with improvised leather straps. Colton positioned himself in front of him, clutching the folder tightly, while the counselor stood by with his arms crossed, observing intently. "Let's try this again," Colton said, his voice now low and dangerous. "Who are you and why are you here? Speak or I'll make sure you disappear forever." Declan, even though he knew his situation was nearly impossible, raised his gaze, meeting Colton's. "I am Declan, Derek's son, and I'm here to expose what you did to my father and the other partners." Colton's face hardened, but there was a glint of surprise in his eyes. "Derek's son?" He let out a short, bitter laugh. "So you've finally shown up. I always wondered if any of my former colleagues' sons would be stupid enough to try and face me." The counselor stepped forward, staring at Colton. "This changes everything. You said there were no more ties to the past. Now Derek's son is here, and he clearly knows more than he should." Colton looked at Declan with hatred. "And that's a problem we're going to solve right now." As the guards kept Declan pinned to the chair, Colton opened the folder again, examining the documents. "You know this doesn't prove anything, don't you?" he said, looking at Declan with a cruel smile. "Even if you managed to get out of here with this, it would just be a poorly told story from a beggar. No one would believe you." Declan stared at Colton, his gaze unwavering. "You may think that now, but the truth always finds a way. You can't hide what you did forever." Colton approached, leaning in until he was face to face with Declan. "The truth is what I say it is, and you, boy, have just made the worst mistake of your life." Declan felt his blood pounding in his temples, but he didn't look away. He knew he was in danger, but he also knew that now Colton was exposed. Even trapped, he felt that he had planted the seed of something bigger, something Colton couldn't control. Declan ran through the streets, still breathless and with his heart racing after his escape from Colton's mansion. The adrenaline was still pulsing through his veins, but his mind was focused on a single goal: exposing the man who had destroyed his family's life. When the doctor who had fired him appeared in his path, Declan almost ignored the call, but the man's words made him stop short. "It's about Colton," said the doctor, his voice low and urgent. "The man who killed your father." Declan spun on his heels, facing the doctor with distrust. "What do you want? Don't you think you've done enough when you fired me? Now I'm being hunted by him, and you think I'll listen to what you have to say?" "Listen, boy," the doctor replied, his eyes shining with a mixture of guilt and determination. "I know I have no moral ground here, but this is bigger than you or me. Come with me to my office. I have something that could change everything." Despite the fear and fatigue, Declan followed the doctor to the small office at the hospital. He entered still looking over his shoulder, fearing that Colton's men might be in pursuit. The doctor closed the door behind them and went straight to a locked cabinet. He took out a metal box that appeared to have been kept with extreme care. "Look at this," said the doctor, placing the contents on the table. He opened the box and took out a small vial with a preserved liquid, a yellowed invoice, and a tube containing blood samples. "This is the poison Colton used against the partners. Here's proof that he bought it illegally with a date, and this is one of the victim's blood, with traces of the poison still present." Declan was open-mouthed, staring at the evidence with wide eyes. "Why? Why do you have this? How did you get it?" The doctor sighed, running his hand over his face. "Back then, Colton bribed me. He paid me monthly to ensure the reports were falsified and to keep my mouth shut. I knew it was wrong, but the money, it was too much. But he stopped paying. He thought I was too secure in my silence. Now all of this is in your hands." Declan picked up the vial and the invoice, feeling the weight of the moment. "Does Colton know you kept this?" "No," the doctor replied firmly. "He believes it was all destroyed, and it's better if it stays that way, because if he finds out, I'm as screwed as you are." Declan stared at the man with skepticism. "And why are you giving this to me now? Why didn't you expose him before?" "Because, boy, I never had the courage," the doctor admitted. "But you do. Just listen closely. If you mention the bribes to the hospital, you'll be stirring up a hornet's nest. They'll swallow you alive, and I won't be able to help you." With the evidence in hand, Declan left the doctor's office, feeling the weight of responsibility crushing his shoulders. He knew taking it to the police would be dangerous, not just for him, but for Evelyn, the doctor, and anyone else linked to Colton. But staying silent wasn't an option. He walked the streets until he found the nearest police station. He entered discreetly, with the hood of his coat covering part of his face. When he reached the counter, he spoke to the receptionist, trying to remain calm. "I have evidence of a serious crime. I need to speak with a detective now." The detective who attended him listened to his story seriously as Declan handed over the vial, the invoice, and the blood sample. "This is enough to open a full investigation," said the detective, analyzing the documents. "You did the right thing by bringing this in." Hours later, the news exploded across the media. Headlines emblazoned newspapers. "Evidence implicates luxury businessman in murder of partners." Colton's name was on every TV channel, accompanied by the evidence Declan had provided. The poison, the purchase records, and the blood samples were undeniable proof that Colton had orchestrated the murders. But Declan knew he needed to go further. He also revealed the bribery scheme at the hospital, even knowing it would put his life at risk. "The public needs to know the whole truth," he said in an anonymous interview. "It's not just about Colton. It's about a corrupt system that allowed him to do this and get away with it for so long." As the media dug into the story, the police issued an arrest warrant for Colton. The Vertis restaurant, once a symbol of luxury and power, became a site surrounded by cameras and unanswered questions. Colton, now a wanted man, tried to flee, but public pressure made it impossible for him to leave the country. For Declan, there was no victory without cost. He knew he had risked everything by exposing the hospital bribes as well, but the courage to finally face Colton's dark legacy was greater than fear. And deep down he knew his father would be proud of him. So the truth finally emerged, bringing justice to those who had been silenced for so long. And Declan, despite the hardships, felt the weight of his father's memory turn into something lighter, a sense of renewed purpose. Declan, tied to the chair, felt sweat dripping down his forehead as Colton and the counselor discussed what to do with him. The tight bindings cut into his wrists, but his mind was in frantic activity. He needed to escape, and quickly. As Colton examined the folder with evidence again, and the counselor talked about eliminating Declan immediately, he noticed a small chance. "You think you can get away with this, boy?" Colton asked, leaning over him. "You made a grave mistake coming here." Declan, buying time, answered calmly, "I did make a mistake, yes, I underestimated how rotten you are. But do you really think this is going to end well for you? Someone knows I'm here. You think no one will come looking for me?" Colton let out a sarcastic laugh. "You're nobody, a drifter. Who would care?" As Colton walked away, going back to discuss with the counselor, Declan began to work discreetly on the bindings, using the edge of a rusty piece of metal that had fallen to the floor during the earlier struggle. He rubbed the metal against the leather straps, trying to loosen them without drawing attention. Colton returned to face him, now holding the vial of poison. "You know what's ironic? You're here tied up, trying to defy me, while the same poison that killed your father could end you now." "Then do it," Declan goaded, seizing the chance to keep him talking. "Show that you're as cowardly as everyone thinks. Because deep down, Colton, you're afraid. Afraid of me. Afraid of the truth." Colton narrowed his eyes, the anger evident. He took a step towards Declan, but before he could do anything, the counselor interrupted him. "Colton, calm down. Killing him now will only complicate things. We need to think of something cleaner." The two began arguing again, giving Declan the precious seconds he needed. With one last effort, he managed to free one of his hands, keeping it still so as not to raise suspicion. He looked around, noticing that the counselor had left the door ajar, and the guards outside were distracted. Taking advantage of a pause in the argument, Declan used all the strength he had to stand up abruptly, pushing the chair against Colton, who staggered back, knocking the vial of poison to the floor. The counselor shouted, "Stop him!" But Declan was already running for the door. The guards tried to block his exit, but Declan grabbed a nearby chair and threw it at them, creating a gap. He ran down the hallway, hearing Colton's shouts behind him. "Get him! Don't let him escape!" Running down a side corridor, Declan saw an open window. Without a second thought, he climbed over the sill and jumped out, falling into a bush that cushioned his fall. Despite the pain in his arm and legs, he got up and started running down the street, ignoring the shouts coming from the mansion. After putting enough distance between them, Declan stopped in an alley to catch his breath. His body ached, but the adrenaline kept him moving. He needed a plan. That's when he heard footsteps behind him and turned around, ready to fight, but found the doctor who had fired him. "Are you all right?" the doctor asked in an almost mocking tone. "Looks like you're running from something." Declan, still panting, replied, "I don't have time for this. I don't care what you think of me or why you're here. Listen, kid. I know Colton is after you, but I have something that can take him down once and for all. Something that can help. Follow me to my office. I promise it's important." Reluctant but curious, Declan followed the doctor, still looking back, fearing Colton's men might catch up to him. He knew he was in danger, but something in the doctor's tone indicated it was worth the risk. In the small hospital office, the doctor locked the door and pulled out a metal box. He opened it, revealing the vial of poison, the invoice, and the blood sample. "This is all you need to take down Colton," he said. "But know that if you involve the hospital bribes, you'll be screwed just as much as me." Declan looked at the evidence, feeling the overwhelming responsibility he now carried. He knew he had to act fast, but he also knew he was entering dangerous territory. "Colton is still hunting me," he thought, "but now I have the cards up my sleeve." Declan took a deep breath, holding the vial of poison with trembling fingers. He looked up at the doctor, trying to comprehend the complexity of the moment. "Why are you doing this now? Why didn't you do it before, when you had everything in your hands? My father, the others, they could have had justice." The doctor let out a bitter laugh, crossing his arms. "You think it's simple, boy. It's not. When Colton started all this, he assured me I would be protected. Enough money to keep my mouth shut and ensure my survival. For years, that worked. But now he stopped paying the monthly bribe. He discarded me as if I were nothing, and I won't let that slide. So, this is not about justice, Declan replied, his tone laden with contempt. You're just doing this for revenge. To hurt Colton because he's not paying you anymore. The doctor shrugged with a cynical smile. And you think it's any different? You're here seeking revenge too. Don't give me that morality spiel. We're in the same boat, kid. Declan felt his blood boil, but he held his tongue. He knew arguing with the doctor would get him nowhere. Still, there was one concern he needed to get off his chest. And what if Colton finds out you had this evidence all along? He'll come after you too. Do you really think you're safe? The doctor narrowed his eyes and leaned forward, pointing a finger at Declan. Listen carefully, kid. I'm giving you this because I want you to deal with Colton on your own. But if you're stupid enough to involve the hospital, to mention the bribes he paid, well, let's just say the consequences for you will be far worse than just dealing with Colton. Declan clenched his fists, feeling the tension rise in the air. Are you threatening me now? It's not a threat, it's a warning, the doctor replied, his voice cold. You have something valuable in your hands. Use it wisely. But don't drag me into your personal crusade, or you'll regret it. Declan fell silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the evidence on the table. He knew the doctor was right on one point. What he had in his hands was powerful, but also dangerous. Taking it to the police meant exposing Colton, but it could also attract unwanted attention to himself and Evelyn. Finally, Declan picked up the vial, the receipt, and the blood sample, carefully storing them all in his backpack. He stood up, looking the doctor directly in the eye. I'll use this, but know this. You're just as guilty as Colton. You don't deserve the same justice I'm seeking. You had years to do the right thing and chose money instead. The doctor didn't respond, just raised an eyebrow, indifferent. Good luck, kid, you'll need it. With his heart racing, Declan left the hospital and walked through the dark streets. He knew Colton was still after him, but the urgency of his mission outweighed the fear. He needed to get that evidence to the police as soon as possible, before anything went wrong. As he approached the police station, he felt the weight of everything at stake. It wasn't just about Colton or the doctor. It was about his father's legacy, about exposing the truth, and perhaps finding some sort of peace for himself. At the station, Declan presented the evidence to the lead detective. He told them everything he knew, omitting only the doctor's involvement and the hospital bribes. He knew that if he mentioned that, he'd be putting his own safety at risk, but he also knew that the most important thing was ensuring Colton was exposed. Hours later, the news exploded in the media. Luxury businessmen implicated in partner murders. The evidence was irrefutable, and Colton was put under intense investigation. The restaurant that had become a symbol of his rise was now a site of public shame. For Declan, the victory was bittersweet. He knew he had risked everything to get here, but he also knew there were more battles ahead. Colton wouldn't give up so easily, and Declan would need to be prepared for whatever came. Over time, the full truth about Colton began to emerge, and justice finally seemed to be on its way. Declan, however, never forgot the doctor's warning. He knew the victory wasn't the end, but just the beginning of a new struggle to rebuild his life and protect those he loved. Declan was sitting on the small couch in Evelyn's apartment, still feeling the weight of what he had done at the police station. The evidence against Colton was now in the hands of the authorities, but something inside him still nagged at him. He looked at Evelyn, who was serving him a cup of tea and watching him with concern. "You did what you had to, Declan," Evelyn said, trying to ease the visible tension on his face. "Colton will face justice, and your father will finally get the bare minimum of dignity he deserves." "I know, Evelyn," Declan replied, holding the cup in his hands but not drinking. "But it wasn't everything. I hid part of the truth. About the hospital, about the doctor, about the bribes." Evelyn frowned, placing her own cup on the table. "You did that because you had to. Exposing the doctor and the hospital would put you at enormous risk. They won't hesitate to come after you, Declan. You're already dealing with Colton, and that's more than enough." Declan shook his head, still staring into the hot liquid. "But it's not right. I saw what the doctor did. He let my father and the others die and hid the truth for years, just for money. How can I just ignore that? If I want the whole truth to come out, I need to tell everything, no matter what it means for me." Evelyn moved closer, sitting beside him and taking his hand. "You're brave, Declan, but you need to think carefully. If you decide to do this, it could be the end of your safety. It won't just be Colton. It'll be the entire system you're up against." Declan looked at her, his eyes determined. "I can't keep hiding, Evelyn. They need to know. If the hospital allowed this to happen, they're guilty too. And I can't be an accomplice to the silence." With Evelyn by his side, Declan returned to the police station that same night. He knew there was no turning back. The decision was made, and he needed to deal with the consequences. When they arrived, the detective who had received the evidence against Colton stood up from his desk, surprised to see them. "Declan, what are you doing here again?" the detective asked, crossing his arms. "I thought we had everything we needed." Declan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of each word before speaking. "I need to share one more thing, something I didn't say before." The detective assessed him carefully. "I'm listening." Declan began to tell everything about the doctor's involvement and the bribes to the hospital. He spoke about how Colton paid to have reports falsified, how the doctor had hidden evidence for years, and how the entire system was corrupt. Each word felt like a weight being lifted from his shoulders, but he knew it put him at a new level of risk. The detective took notes, his face growing increasingly serious. "This is serious, Declan. Do you realize you're exposing not just Colton, but a larger scheme? This could have consequences for you personally." "I know," Declan responded, his voice firm. "But they need to be held accountable. My father died because of them. And they kept profiting from it while other people suffered. I can't stay silent." Evelyn watched him, concern evident on her face, but also a touch of pride at his courage. The detective closed his notebook, sighing. "This is going to be complicated, but we'll investigate. If what you're saying is true, you just opened up a whole new case, but know that it's going to be dangerous. People with power don't like being exposed." "I already know that," Declan replied, meeting the detective's gaze, "but I'm ready." As they left the police station, Declan felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He knew he had just taken another step towards the truth, but he also knew he was putting himself directly in the crosshairs of a corrupt and powerful system. Evelyn walked silently by his side, yet holding his arm as if to convey strength. "You did what you had to," she finally said. "But Declan, now you need to be ready. They will retaliate." "Let them come," he responded with determination. "I won't stop until the whole truth is known." And with that, Declan prepared for the final battle, facing not just Colton but all those who had profited from his family's suffering. Months after delivering all the evidence to the authorities, Declan and Evelyn watched as the news dominating the television channels unfolded. Colton's face appeared on the screen, accompanied by the headline, "Luxury businessman and hospital involved in corruption and murders." Next to him, photos of the doctor and others involved in the scheme also took up space in the news report. After weeks of investigation, the trial revealed irrefutable evidence of bribery, falsification of medical records, and murders linked to businessman Colton and the hospital involved. Today, both received their sentences: life in prison for Colton and 20 years for the accomplice doctor, along with the revocation of his medical license, the anchor announced in a solemn tone. Evelyn looked at Declan, her eyes shining with relief. It's finally over. They paid for everything they did. Declan, sitting beside her, took a deep breath. Yes, my father can finally rest in peace, and they will never do this to anyone else. Life slowly returned to normal for Declan and Evelyn. With the help of friends and supporters, Declan was able to resume his career as a nurse. He started working at a community clinic, helping those most in need. Evelyn, for her part, found renewed strength to continue her legacy of helping people, now without the weight of the fear she had carried for years. "Do you know, Declan," Evelyn said on a peaceful day as she planted flowers in the small garden of their apartment, "your father would be so proud of you, not just for seeking justice, but for never giving up, even when everything seemed lost." Declan smiled, adjusting a watering can. "I was only able to do it because I had you by my side, Evelyn. I wouldn't have made it this far without your strength." In time, Colton's restaurant was transformed into a community space dedicated to supporting families in vulnerable situations. Declan and Evelyn were invited to the opening, where they received recognition for their courageous actions. As he looked at the sign now displaying his father's name in tribute, Declan felt a wave of peace wash over his heart. He knew the path had been difficult, but the result was worth every risk. His family's legacy was preserved, and the truth had finally triumphed. As the sun set on that special day, Declan and Evelyn walked together, smiles on their faces, and the certainty that justice had prevailed. For them, the end of that dark chapter marked the beginning of a new life, filled with purpose, hope, and gratitude for having faced the impossible and won. And so, with the truth exposed and evil punished, Declan and Evelyn found what they had been seeking, a happy ending and a chance to start over. If you liked this story, we invite you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to continue bringing exciting stories almost every day. Don't miss the next surprising narrative that is about to appear on your screen. We are immensely grateful to have you here with us. Now you can click on the links that are appearing on the screen right now. We have a special selection just for you, filled with valuable stories and guaranteed entertainment. See you there.